The smoke came under the door before the alarm ever went off, and by the time Walt Hendricks understood what was happening, the hallway of his own cabin was already glowing orange at the edges. He didn't think. He didn't grab his boots, didn't grab his wallet, didn't grab a single photograph off the wall. He grabbed the leash hanging by the door out of pure habit, and he screamed one word into the smoke that filled his throat like ash-soaked cotton. Bear. Somewhere in that thick black air, a dog who could barely see through his own panic came crashing toward the sound of his name, and together an old man and an old dog ran through fire that wanted to keep them both. If you are reading this and you have ever loved an animal so much that you would run back into danger for them without a single second of hesitation, you already understand what this story is about before it even begins. Would you have run back in? Most people say yes without thinking. But saying it and doing it when the heat is already blistering your skin are two very different kinds of brave. Walt Hendricks found that out on a Tuesday night in September, in the mountains outside a small town in Oregon, when the fire that had been a rumor on the news for 3 days finally arrived at his front porch. He was 68 years old. He had lived alone in that cabin for 11 years, ever since his wife Carol passed, and in all that time, the only thing that had kept the silence in that house from swallowing him whole was an 80-pound black lab mix named Bear, who slept at the foot of his bed every single night like he was standing guard against something Walt couldn't name. There were mornings, especially in the first years after Carol died, when the only reason Walt got out of bed at all was the sound of Bear's tail thumping against the floorboards, patient and unhurried, waiting for a bowl of food and a walk down the road. Small, ordinary needs that gave Walt's own days a shape they otherwise would not have had. Walt used to joke to the mailman that Bear was the last good listener left in his life, the only one who never interrupted, never judged, and never once left the room when Walt started talking about Carol and couldn't stop. That cabin wasn't fancy. It had a leaky roof over the porch and a wood stove that smoked a little when the wind came from the west, and every board of it had absorbed 40 years of a life Walt had built first with Carol, and then, after she was gone, with a scruffy dog he'd pulled out of a shelter on a whim because the shelter worker said nobody wanted him. He was 5 years old then, already too big, already too old for most families who wanted a puppy. Walt looked at him through the chain link and said, "Well, nobody wants me either. Not really, not anymore." That was the whole conversation. Walt signed the papers 20 minutes later. For 6 years, Bear had been the heartbeat of that house. He wasn't a fancy dog. He didn't do tricks. He fetched a stick maybe once a season if he felt like it, and mostly he just existed beside Walt with a steady, patient kind of loyalty that never asked for anything except a hand resting on his back and a bowl filled twice a day. Walt talked to him the way some men talk to their reflection in the mirror, except Bear actually answered in his own way, with a thump of his tail or a low groan of agreement or a nudge of his nose against Walt's knee, exactly when Walt needed it most. Neighbors who saw them walking the gravel road every morning said they moved like two old men who had signed some kind of pact a long time ago. Bear had gone gray around his muzzle. Walt had gone gray everywhere else. They both walked a little slower than they used to, and they both stopped at the same bend in the road to catch their breath, though only one of them would ever admit to needing the rest. Carol used to say that Bear had been sent to them, not bought, not adopted, but sent, the way she believed certain things arrived in a person's life exactly when they were needed, and not 1 day sooner. She only got to share 4 years with him before the cancer took her, but in those 4 years she claimed Bear as much as Walt did, feeding him scraps of bacon under the table when she thought Walt wasn't looking, letting him sleep on her side of the bed on the nights Walt worked late at the hardware store he used to manage before he retired. When she died, it was Bear who wouldn't leave Walt's side for nearly a month straight, following him from room to room like he understood, in whatever way a dog understands these things, that the house had lost something it was never going to get back, and that the man left standing in it needed watching. Walt used to tell people, half joking and half not, that Bear had taken over grieving duty when Walt himself ran out of tears to cry. He'd sit at the foot of the bed on the anniversary of Carol's death every single year, and Walt swore the dog knew the date, knew it in his bones, the way animals sometimes know things people can't explain, because Bear got quieter on that day every year, stayed closer, pressed his weight against Walt's leg like an anchor, keeping him from drifting too far out. The wildfire season had been bad that year, worse than anyone in that county could remember, and for 3 days the sky over Walt's property had turned the color of a bruise, thick with smoke that drifted in from ridges nobody thought would ever burn close enough to matter. Walt watched the news reports on the small television in his kitchen, and he told himself the same thing everyone tells themselves when disaster is still a few miles away. It won't come here. It never comes here. He kept feeding Bear his dinner at 5 o'clock sharp, and he kept sitting on the porch in the evenings, watching the strange orange light behind the trees, refusing to believe that a fire could reach all the way down into the valley where his cabin sat tucked against the hillside like it had grown there. He was wrong, and the fire did not care that he doubted it. It came fast, faster than any of the warnings had prepared him for, faster than the sheriff's evacuation call that reached his phone only minutes before the first embers landed on his roof like burning snow. Walt was already in bed when his phone screamed with the emergency alert, and by the time he threw off the blankets and ran to the window, he could see the tree line at the edge of his property already lit up like a wall of torches, closer than anything on the news had ever shown him. The wind that night was a monster all its own, throwing sparks across distances that should have been impossible, and within minutes, the fire wasn't coming toward the cabin anymore. It was already there. Later, Walt would try to explain to people what that particular kind of fear feels like. The fear of realizing a warning you dismissed for 3 straight days has arrived at your door with no more room for doubt. It isn't loud at first. It is a strange, terrible quiet, a half second where your whole body understands the truth before your mind catches up to it. Walt stood at that window for maybe 2 full seconds, no longer, watching flame move through trees he had walked past 10,000 times, and in those 2 seconds he thought of Carol's wedding ring in the dresser drawer, and the photo albums on the bottom shelf of the hallway closet, and every single thing in that house he would never see again. And then his body moved before his mind finished the thought, because somewhere underneath all of it, louder than any grief for objects, was the one thought that mattered. Bear was still inside. Smoke filled the hallway before Walt even reached the bedroom door, thick and black and choking, the kind of smoke that steals the air right out of your lungs and replaces it with something that burns going down. His eyes streamed. His throat closed, and in that first terrible second of pure animal fear, Walt Hendricks thought only one thought, clear and sharp above everything else. Where is Bear? He had heard him barking from somewhere near the kitchen only a minute earlier, that low, frantic bark Bear only used when something was deeply wrong, a bark Walt had heard, maybe 3 times in 6 years, and had learned to take seriously every time. Now the barking had stopped, and the silence underneath the roar of the fire outside was the worst sound Walt had ever heard in his life. He dropped to his knees because the smoke was thinner near the floor, and he crawled through his own burning house, calling Bear's name over and over into air that felt like breathing coals. His hands found the kitchen doorway. His hands found the leg of the table. And then his hands found fur, hot and trembling, pressed low against the floor beneath the window where Bear had gone to escape the smoke rising above him, exactly the way a smart old dog would, exactly the way Walt had never taught him to do, but somehow he knew. Bear's back legs were already burned. Walt didn't know it yet. Not fully, not in the dark and the smoke, but he could feel his dog shaking against his side, could hear a whimper that broke something loose in his own chest, something that had nothing to do with the smoke. He grabbed the leash, still looped around his own wrist without remembering when he'd put it there, and he didn't clip it to anything. He simply wrapped both arms around 80 pounds of terrified, injured dog, and he stood up into fire that was already licking at the curtains 6 feet away, and he ran. The front door was already burning at its edges when Walt reached it, throwing his shoulder against the wood the way he hadn't done anything physical in 15 years, feeling the heat sear across the back of his hand as it swung open into a night that had turned into something closer to hell than anyone's memory of home. Sparks rained down around them like the sky itself was falling apart. The porch steps groaned and one gave way beneath his boot as he stumbled down them, bare a dead weight of pure animal fear in his arms, both of them coughing, both of them crying out, sounds that weren't words anymore, just raw human and animal terror given voice in the dark. He didn't stop running until he reached the old truck parked 40 yards down the gravel drive, the one place he'd told himself for 3 days he would go if it ever came to this, and never actually believed he would need. His hands shook so badly he dropped the keys twice in the dirt before he got the door open, before he laid bare across the bench seat as gently as a man can manage when his own hands are shaking and his own lungs are screaming, and before he threw the truck into reverse and drove away from the only home he had built in 68 years of living, watching it disappear into flame and smoke in the rearview mirror, while the dog beside him bled on. They made it to the evacuation center at the elementary school gymnasium 40 minutes later. Walt, still in the pajama pants he'd been wearing when the alert came through. No shoes, no shirt, nothing but a burned hand and a dog whose back legs had been badly injured by fire and falling embers during those last desperate seconds in the house. A volunteer firefighter took one look at both of them and called for the mobile veterinary unit that had been set up in the parking lot for exactly this kind of nightmare. One of 100 small nightmares playing out across that county in the same terrible hours. The vet, a young woman named Dr. Reyes who had been working 18 hours straight treating burned and frightened animals brought in by burned and frightened owners, knelt beside Bear on a blanket spread across the gymnasium floor and told Walt the truth as gently as she could manage. 2nd and 3rd degree burns across both hind legs. Painful. Serious, but treatable if they moved carefully and moved fast. Walt sat on that gymnasium floor in his pajama pants with soot still streaked across his face, and he held Bear's head in his lap while the vet worked, and he did not cry, not yet, not in front of anyone. He simply kept whispering the same 4 words into his dog's ear over and over, like a promise he needed to hear as much as Bear did. "You're okay. I'm here." Around them, that gymnasium had filled with the sound of other families living out their own version of the same night. A teenage girl clutching a cat carrier and refusing to let go of it, even to sign the intake papers. An elderly couple sharing one folding chair, a small terrier trembling between them. Somewhere near the basketball hoop, a volunteer was pouring dog food into paper bowls lined up in a row like an assembly line of small mercies. Walt looked around at all of it, at every stranger holding on to some scared animal like it was the last solid thing left in the world, and he understood, in a way he never had before that night, that he was not the only person whose whole life had just been measured in minutes and smoke. The fire took the cabin completely. Walt learned this 2 days later, standing at the edge of what used to be his driveway, looking at a foundation and a chimney and nothing else. 40 years of memory reduced to ash and twisted metal in the space of a single night. The wood stove had survived, oddly, standing black and alone in a field of gray rubble like a tombstone for a life that no longer existed. Walt stood there for a long time, and neighbors who drove past said later they saw him just standing, not moving, one bandaged hand hanging at his side, staring at nothing the way a man stares when the thing he's looking at used to be everything. He didn't have insurance that covered half of what was lost. He didn't have family close enough to take him in for more than a week or two. What he had was a rented, single-wide trailer on the edge of town that the county arranged for displaced residents, thin walls and a leaking faucet and a smell of old carpet that never quite went away. And he had a dog who needed 6 weeks of wound care and pain management and a recovery that nobody could promise would go perfectly. Walt brought Bear home from the emergency animal shelter 3 days after the fire, both of them wrapped in bandages, both of them changed by something neither one could put into words. Bear's back legs were shaved and wrapped, the burns deep enough that the vet warned Walt about possible permanent damage to the muscle, about a recovery timeline measured in months instead of weeks, about the very real chance that Bear might never walk quite the same again. Walt listened to every word standing in that trailer's tiny kitchen, and then he looked down at his dog lying on a donated dog bed in the corner, cone around his neck, eyes half closed with pain and exhaustion, and he made a decision that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with love. He would not let this dog heal alone in a corner of a trailer that didn't feel like home to either of them. He would sleep on that floor beside him every single night for as long as it took. And that is exactly what he did. For the first 2 weeks, Bear could barely stand. The burns on his legs had to be cleaned twice a day, a process that made him cry out in a way that broke something in Walt every single time, a high, thin sound that no dog should ever have to make, and no man should ever have to hear come from an animal he loved. Walt learned to hold the bandages steady with hands that had burns of their own, still healing, learned to talk in a low, steady voice through the whole process because he discovered early on that the sound of his voice seemed to calm Bear more than anything else, more than the pain medication, more than the treats he offered as bribes that Bear was usually too much. So Walt talked. He talked while he changed bandages. He talked at 2 a.m. when Bear whimpered in his sleep from dreams that were probably full of smoke and fire. He talked while he sat on that hard trailer floor with his back against the wall and his knees aching from the cold, night after night, because Bear slept easier when Walt's hand rested on his side, rising and falling with each breath, proof that they had both made it out alive. At first, Walt talked about small things. He talked about the weather, about the news, about the neighbor's chickens that kept getting loose. But somewhere around the 3rd week, alone in the dark with a dog who couldn't judge him and couldn't leave, Walt Hendricks started talking about things he hadn't said out loud in years. He told Bear about Carol. He told him about the way she used to hum while she cooked, off-key and happy, some song from a radio station that didn't exist anymore. He told him about the day she got sick, and the 18 months after, and the particular silence of a house the morning after a funeral when the casseroles stop coming and everyone goes back to their own lives and you're left standing in a kitchen that suddenly feels 3 sizes too big. He told Bear things he had never told another living soul. Not his brother, not his neighbors, not the grief counselor he'd gone to twice and never gone back to, because it felt like ripping a bandage off a wound that hadn't finished healing. And somewhere in those long dark nights on a cold trailer floor, something started shifting in Walt that he didn't notice happening until it had already happened. He started making promises to Bear, small ones at first. "We'll get you strong again, buddy, then bigger ones. We're gonna build something new, you and me. Not the same as before. Something ours." He said these things the way you say things to fill silence, not really believing them, just needing something to say into the dark. But dogs have a way of making a man mean what he says, because Bear would lift his head every time Walt spoke those words, would look at him with those tired brown eyes like he was actually listening, actually holding Walt to it, and slowly, painfully, without any single dramatic moment marking the change, Walt Hendricks stopped talking about rebuilding a life and started actually wanting one. The struggle of those months was not simple, and it was not fast. There were setbacks that felt like the whole world caving in again. In the 5th week, one of Bear's wounds became infected, and the vet's face went serious in a way that made Walt's stomach drop straight through the trailer floor. There were 3 days of antibiotics and fear, and Walt barely sleeping at all, sitting up against the wall with his hand on Bear's chest just to feel it rise and fall, terrified that this dog who had already survived a fire might not survive the healing from it. There was the afternoon Bear tried to stand on his own for the first time since the fire, legs shaking, and collapsed after 2 steps. And the sound he made hitting the floor was so pitiful that Walt found himself crying for the first time since the disaster, not for the house, not for the 40 years of memories turned to ash, but for this one animal who had done nothing to deserve any of this. During the infection scare in the 5th week, Walt drove Bear back to the emergency clinic at 11 at night, running red lights on empty roads because he could not make himself stop for even 30 seconds, could not make himself wait when Bear's fever felt like a furnace against his own arm. He sat in that clinic waiting room until sunrise, drinking bad coffee from a vending machine, replaying every decision he'd made since the fire, wondering if he'd cleaned the wounds wrong, wondered if he should have pushed harder for the dog to see a specialist instead of trusting his own 2 shaking hands. When the vet finally came out and told him the antibiotics were working, that Bear's fever had broken an hour earlier, Walt put his face in his hands right there in the waiting room and let himself shake for a full minute before he trusted his legs to carry him back to the exam room. There was the morning Walt drove to the pharmacy for more gauze and antiseptic and had to sit in the parking lot for 10 minutes before he could make himself go inside, because the pharmacist, a kind woman named Sheila, who had known Walt for 20 years, kept asking gentle questions about the house, about what he'd lost, about whether he had somewhere warm to stay, and Walt found he sat in that truck with his hands on the wheel and let himself feel, just for those 10 minutes, the full weight of everything that had happened, before he wiped his face, walked in, and bought the gauze like a man who had everything under control. There was the loneliness of it too, a loneliness Walt hadn't expected. Friends checked in for the first week or 2 after the fire, brought casseroles and spare blankets the way people do, and then, as fires always do, the news cycle moved on, and the world around Walt kept turning while his own world stayed frozen in that trailer with a wounded dog and a burned hand, and a grief that had somehow doubled instead of healing. Grief for Carol tangled up now with grief for the house that held every trace of her, tangled up with the raw fear of maybe losing Bear too. Walt found himself some nights sitting on that floor wondering honestly whether he had the strength left in him to keep doing this, to keep believing things would get better when every week. He was 68 years old. He had already buried a wife. He had already lost a home, and some nights, in the particular darkness that comes at 3 in the morning when nothing feels survivable, Walt genuinely did not know if he had another rebuilding left in him. It was Bear who answered that question, though not in any way a person could have planned. It happened in the 7th week, on an ordinary Tuesday morning that Walt would remember for the rest of his life with a clarity most ordinary mornings never earn. Walt had gotten up early, made his coffee, sat down on the floor beside Bear's bed the way he did every morning to check the bandages and talk to him for a while before the day started, and Bear, without any warning, without any command, pushed himself up onto 4 legs, wobbled for 1 terrifying second, and took 3 full steady steps across the trailer floor to press his head against Walt's knee. Walt sat completely still. He didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe wrong, afraid that any sudden motion might undo whatever miracle was happening in front of him. Bear's back legs, scarred now with patches where fur would never fully grow back the same, held his weight. They trembled, but they held. And Bear looked up at Walt with an expression that Walt would later describe to anyone who asked as pure, plain relief, the look of a creature who had been fighting a private battle in silence and had just, quietly, without fanfare, won it. Walt wrapped both arms around his dog right there on the trailer floor, and he wept the way he had not let himself weep since Carol's funeral. Not sad tears this time, but something else entirely, something closer to release, like a fist unclenching after holding on too tight for too long. He held on to Bear, and Bear leaned his whole weight into him, steady on 4 legs that had once been burned nearly past saving, and Walt said the only words that felt true enough for that moment. "You did it. You beautiful, stubborn son of a gun. You did it." He called Dr. Reyes that same afternoon, practically shouting the news into the phone like a man reporting a birth, and she laughed on the other end in a way that told Walt she'd been waiting weeks to hear exactly this kind of call. She drove out that evening on her way home, just to see it for herself, and she knelt on the trailer floor running her hands carefully along Bear's back legs while he stood there, patient as ever, tail wagging low and steady. She told Walt the scar tissue would always be there, that the muscle underneath would never work quite the way it used to, that Bear would likely always favor that left leg some, especially in cold weather or after a long walk. But she also told him something Walt would carry with him for the rest of his life. She said healing was never about erasing what happened. It was about the body, and sometimes the heart, finding a new way to carry the weight of what it had survived. But it wasn't only Bear's healing that broke loose in Walt that morning. Something in himself broke loose too. Some knot he'd been carrying since Carol died, and had carried heavier still since the fire. A knot made of guilt and fear, and the quiet certainty that he was too old, too tired, too far past his best years to build anything new. Watching Bear take those 3 shaking steps toward him, Walt understood with a clarity that felt almost physical, that healing was never about going back to how things used to be. Bear would never walk exactly like he used to. The scars on his legs would stay for the rest of his life, visible reminders every single day of what that fire had taken from both of them. But he was walking. He was here. He had rebuilt himself, one impossible step at a time, without ever once giving up. And if an old dog with burned legs could do that, Walt figured he had no excuse not to try the same. He thought, too, about all those nights he'd spent talking to Bear about Carol, about the life they'd rebuild, words he'd said mostly to fill silence and keep his own fear at bay. He realized now that somewhere in the repetition of those promises, in saying them out loud night after night to an animal who couldn't talk back but never once stopped listening, he had accidentally talked himself into believing them. Bear hadn't just healed his own legs on that trailer floor. He had given Walt a reason to keep saying words until they turned true, and that, Walt thought, kneeling there with his arms wrapped around his dog, might be the closest thing to a miracle a man like him was ever going to get. The weeks after that morning moved differently. Bear's recovery accelerated the way recoveries sometimes do once the body decides it's ready, and within a month he was walking the gravel road outside the trailer again, slower than before, with a slight favor to his back left leg that would stay with him forever, but walking, tail up, nose working the air like the world still had things in it worth investigating. Walt started making calls he'd been avoiding, contractors and insurance adjusters and a county office that helped displaced residents rebuild on their original land. It was slow, bureaucratic, frustrating work, the kind of paperwork that would have made old Walt want to give up out of sheer exhaustion. But new Walt, the Walt who had spent 7 weeks sleeping on a trailer floor whispering promises to a dying dog who refused to die, kept making the calls anyway. Ground broke on the new cabin the following spring. Smaller than the old one, simpler, built with money that came slower than Walt wanted, and help from neighbors who showed up on weekends with tools and casseroles and stories of their own losses from that same terrible fire season. Walt worked alongside them every day he was able, and every single day Bear lay in the shade nearby, watching, tail thumping against the dirt whenever Walt looked over to check on him, the two of them rebuilding something together, plank by plank, the same way they had rebuilt each other, breath by breath, on a trailer floor that neither one of them would enter. One of the neighbors, a younger man named Petey who had lost his own barn in the same fire, asked Walt one afternoon why he'd bothered rebuilding on the same land at all. Why not sell the property and start somewhere the sky didn't carry so much memory of smoke? Walt thought about it for a long moment, hammer resting on his knee, and then he nodded toward Bear asleep in the shade. Because he came back to this ground on his own 4 legs after it nearly took him, Walt said. Man ought to have at least that much courage about his own life. Petey didn't have an answer for that, and he didn't need one. He just picked his hammer back up and kept working. The day Walt carried the last box into the finished cabin, nearly a year after the fire, Bear walked in ahead of him on legs that still bore the scars, but no longer trembled, and he found a patch of afternoon sun coming through the new front window, and he lay down in it with a groan of pure contentment that Walt had not heard from him since long before the fire ever happened. Walt stood in the doorway of his new home and watched his old dog settle into that sunlight, and he felt something settle inside his own chest, too, something that had been unsettled since the night Carol died, maybe longer than that, maybe unsettled his whole life without him ever noticing. He sat down on the floor beside Bear, the way he had 100 nights before in a trailer that smelled like old carpet and fear, and he rested his hand on his dog's side, feeling it rise and fall, slow and steady and alive. "We made it, buddy," he said quietly, and Bear's tail thumped twice against the new wood floor in answer, the same steady rhythm it always had, the sound of a promise kept. Walt still walks that gravel road every morning, a little slower now than he was even a year ago, and Bear still walks beside him, favoring that back leg just slightly, gray creeping further into his muzzle with each passing season. Neighbors still say they move like 2 old men who signed some kind of pact a long time ago, and in a way that's exactly what they did, sealed not with paper or promises spoken in daylight, but with a fire that tried to take everything from both of them and instead left them with something neither one expected. Bear healed close to perfect, scars and all. Walt healed crooked, in ways he's still discovering, but somehow more whole than he was before the flames ever came, because a fire that takes your house can also, if you let it, burn away everything you were only pretending to have already gotten over. Some nights, sitting on the new porch with Bear stretched out beside his chair, Walt still thinks about that trailer floor, about the cold coming up through the thin carpet, about the sound of his own voice in the dark, saying things he didn't know, he still believed until he heard himself say them. He doesn't tell that story to impress anyone. He tells it because he thinks somebody out there, some night, alone in their own version of a burned-down life, might need to hear that rebuilding rarely looks the way you pictured it, and that sometimes the thing that gets you through it isn't a plan or a program or even faith exactly, but a warm body breathing steady beside you, refusing, in its own quiet way, to let you give up. He knows the new cabin isn't the same as the old one, and he's stopped pretending it needs to be. It has a different creak in the floorboards, a different view out the kitchen window, a chimney built from new brick instead of the one his own father helped lay decades ago. But it has Bear in it, older now, scarred now, and somehow more fully his than that dog had ever been before the fire took everything and gave something back in return. If this story reached something in you tonight, sit with these questions for a minute before you scroll away. Have you ever had an animal pull you through a season of your life you weren't sure you'd survive? A dog or a horse or a cat who simply stayed beside you until staying was enough to change everything? And if you have lost a home, or a person, or a piece of yourself you thought was gone for good, what was the thing or the creature that finally made you want to rebuild? Write it in the comments below, because somebody else scrolling through tonight, sitting alone the way Walt once did, needs to read your answer as much as they needed to hear this story. If you love these kinds of human and animal bond stories, hit that subscribe button, because every single week we bring you a new story like this one. A story that will touch your heart and remind you that love, the real kind, the kind that walks through fire for you, never really leaves. Like this video if Bear's story moved you the way it moved us to tell it. Share it with someone who needs a reminder tonight that they are not alone, and we will see you in the next story.